A new scientific study is questioning the claim that the Shroud of Turin is really the burial cloth of Jesus Christ.
1988 research seen here in this documentary used carbon dating to determine the cloth was from medieval times, and the whole thing was a hoax.
In a cathedral in Turin lies a cloth that defies explanation. A faint image of a man appears on it, wounded, crucified, with real blood still red after centuries.
The Shroud of Turin is no forgery. The shroud is a cloth that, according to tradition, was used to wrap the body of Jesus after his crucifixion.
Barrie Schwortz, a technical photographer sent to document it in 1978, spent 120 hours examining the shroud, expecting a medieval fake. What he found shattered everything he thought he knew. No paint, no pigment, no known method. And now, new DNA evidence hints this cloth touched people across continents, from Europe to India. Who is this man on the shroud? How was this image made? And why has it baffled the world's brightest minds for centuries? Tonight we uncover the secrets Barrie witnessed, and the mystery the world still cannot explain. Shroud's unsolved, silent mystery. Barrie Schwortz was not a religious man looking for a miracle. He was a technical photographer and a graduate of the Brooks Institute of Photography, one of the most respected photographic institutions in the country. His work was scientific, precise, and analytical. He spent his career shooting for aerospace companies, for research laboratories, for institutions where accuracy was not a suggestion, but a requirement. When the Shroud of Turin research project, known as STURP, began assembling a team in the late 1970s, they needed someone who could document their examination with the kind of rigor that would hold up in a peer-reviewed context. They recruited Barrie through a colleague named Don Lynn, who worked at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory. Barrie's initial reaction was something close to amusement. He was raised as an Orthodox Jew.
I was raised in an Orthodox Jewish home, and I didn't know much about Jesus.
The Shroud of Turin was, in his mind, the ultimate Christian relic. And he had no connection to it, no interest in it, and frankly, no reason to believe it was anything other than a piece of medieval art. He said publicly, more than once, that he expected to arrive in Turin, take one look, see the paint and the brush strokes, and go home. He later admitted with a dry laugh that he spent decades regretting saying that out loud. He even confessed years later during a talk at the Vatican that he initially viewed the whole thing as a free trip to Italy. But there was a moment during the planning phase that stuck with him. He asked Don Lynn the question that had been quietly nagging him. What is a Jewish man doing on a team studying a Christian relic? And Don, who was Catholic, looked at him and said something that Barrie would repeat for the rest of his life. Don said, "Have you forgotten that the man in question was a Jew?" And then he said, "Don't you think God would want one of his chosen people on our team?" Barrie laughed it off, but he stayed on the team. In October of 1978, Barrie Schwortz walked into a room in the Royal Palace of Turin and came face to face with the shroud for the first time. The team had 120 consecutive hours to work. They set up equipment. They ran tests around the clock. And Barrie began photographing. He made large format photographs. He documented every test, every sample, every procedure. And as the hours turned into days, something began to shift inside him. Not a dramatic conversion, not a lightning bolt, something quieter, something more unsettling. There was no paint, there were no brush strokes. I was not on the surface of the cloth. There was not on the surface of the cloth the way paint sits on canvas. It was in the fibers themselves, a chemical change in the topmost layer of the linen, a dehydrative oxidation of the cellulose that had somehow been produced by a mechanism nobody in the room could identify.
Through the generations, many have tried to decode the Turin Shroud's secrets. The image it carries is clear, but there's no trace of pigment or brush strokes.
Barrie did not become a believer that week. He became something more complicated. He became a skeptic who could no longer rely on his original assumption. The thing he had been certain about, that this was a painting, had just been scientifically eliminated, and nothing had come along to replace it. He went home to Los Angeles carrying that discomfort like a stone in his pocket, and it would stay there for the next 17 years. Ancient cloth, modern enigma. Let me walk you through what the STURP team actually found, because the details matter, and they are genuinely strange. Over 120 hours of direct examination by more than 30 scientists and engineers produced a data set that has never been replicated or seriously challenged in the decades since. The image on the shroud is what scientists call a superficial phenomenon. It exists only on the outermost fibers of the linen threads. It does not penetrate. It does not soak through. If you pulled a single fiber from the cloth, the discoloration would be on one side only, and only on the very tip. The colored fibers are uniformly colored, meaning each individual fiber is either fully discolored or completely untouched. There is no gradient within a single fiber. That rules out any liquid application, any painting technique, any dye, any stain. A liquid would wick into the fiber. This did not. There were no pigments, no binding media, no brush strokes visible under any magnification. The image chromophore, the thing that creates the visible color, turned out to be a conjugated carbonyl produced within the cellulose structure itself through a dehydrative oxidation process. In plain language, the top layer of the linen fibers had been chemically altered, aged in a way that created a visible yellowing pattern, but the mechanism that caused this alteration was unknown. It was not heat. It was not light. It was not any chemical they could identify. And then there was the three-dimensional data. In 1976, before STURP even began its examination, physicists John Jackson and Eric Jumper ran the shroud image through a VP8 image analyzer, a device developed for NASA to convert brightness values into topographic relief. When they fed in photographs of paintings, photographs of other faces, they got distorted, meaningless results. When they fed in the shroud image, they got a geometrically accurate, three-dimensional rendering of a human form. The brightness of the image at any given point appeared to correlate directly with the distance between the body and the cloth.
And so the shroud is believed to be a holy relic because you don't get much more holy than the actual blood of Jesus.
No painting in history encodes that kind of data. No photograph encodes it either. This was spatial information embedded in a two-dimensional image, and nobody could explain how it got there. The STURP team published their final report in 1981. The conclusion read, and I am quoting directly from the document, "It is stated that the shroud image is that of a real human form of a scourged, crucified man, and that it is not the product of an artist." What followed that report was not what you might expect. There was no major scientific debate. There was no rush of follow-up studies. There was, for the most part, a strange and uncomfortable silence from mainstream academia. The findings did not fit neatly into any existing framework. If you accepted them, you were left with an object that should not exist. If you rejected them, you had to explain what was wrong with the methodology, and nobody could. So the scientific community did what it often does when confronted with something that does not fit. It looked away. And that silence is worth sitting with for a moment, because when a team of credentialed scientists publishes peer-reviewed findings that an object defies known explanation, and the response is not debate, but avoidance, that tells you something. Not about the object, about us. The blood that stayed red of all the findings from the 1978 STURP examination, there is one that haunted Barrie Schwortz more than any other. Not the image, not the three-dimensional data. The blood. Specifically the color of the blood, because old blood does not stay red. That is basic chemistry. Hemoglobin oxidizes over time into methemoglobin, which darkens. Blood on a cloth should turn brown or black within hours, certainly within days. The stains on the Shroud of Turin were still red, and for 17 years, And eventually tear that wall down was Dr. Alan Adler. Adler was not a general scientist dabbling in blood work. He was one of the foremost experts in the world on porphyrins, the class of molecules that includes the heme group inside hemoglobin. He was a professor of chemistry, a specialist in the exact compounds he was being asked to analyze. And he was also Jewish, a detail that mattered to Barrie because it meant Adler had no religious motivation to find anything one way or the other. He and his colleague, Dr. John Heller, ran 12 separate diagnostic tests on the reddish stains from the shroud. 12. Not 1 or 2 quick checks. A full battery of microchemical, spectroscopic, and immunological analyses. They confirmed the presence of hemoglobin. They confirmed albumin. They confirmed immunoglobulins and other blood serum proteins. Under ultraviolet photography, every single blood wound on the cloth showed a distinct serum clot retraction ring, the faint halo of separated serum that forms around a clot as it dries. That detail is invisible to the naked eye, but completely consistent with real wound exudates transferring from a body to cloth. You cannot paint a serum halo. You cannot fake it.
Scientists have confirmed it is not a work of art. It's not man-made. No one's worshiping some kind of man-made idol or relic here.
It is a forensic signature that only happens when actual clotted blood makes contact with fabric. Independent testing by the Italian pathologist Dr. Pierluigi Baima Bellone confirmed the blood as type AB, a type that is relatively rare worldwide at roughly 3 to 5% of the population, but more commonly found among populations in the Middle East. Bellone's work was conducted separately from STIRP, which gave the findings an additional layer of credibility. 2 independent research efforts, using different methodologies, reaching the same conclusion. The stains were real human blood, but none of that explained the color. That question sat unanswered for years, and it was the thing Barrie kept coming back to. In mid-1995, he was on one of his regular phone calls with Adler, and he raised the issue again. The blood is still red. That should not be possible. Adler got irritated. He said, "Did you not read my paper?" And then he walked Barrie through it one more time. When a human body undergoes extreme, prolonged physical trauma, and the kind of beating and torture that the man on the shroud clearly endured, the red blood cells break down faster than the liver can process them. Hemoglobin floods out of the ruptured cells and gets converted into bilirubin, a bile pigment the liver produces during this breakdown. Under normal circumstances, the body manages this process. Under extreme trauma, the system is overwhelmed. Unconjugated bilirubin pours into the bloodstream in massive quantities. Bilirubin is yellow-orange in color. When it mixes with the brown tones of oxidized hemoglobin, the result is a persistent reddish hue. Adler had found abnormally high levels of bilirubin in the shroud blood samples. The blood was not just old blood that had somehow stayed red for no reason. It was the blood of a man whose body had been so badly brutalized that his liver had flooded his system with bile pigments before he died. The chemistry was telling a story of suffering. Now it is worth noting that the bilirubin hypothesis is still discussed and debated within the scientific community. Some researchers have explored alternative explanations for the persistent color, including the possible role of saponin residues from ancient linen processing. The science is not entirely settled, and that honesty matters. But what Adler demonstrated, and what multiple peer-reviewed publications confirmed, is that the stains are not paint, not dye, and not iron oxide applied by a medieval artist. They are biologically consistent with real human blood altered by catastrophic physical trauma. For Barrie, that phone call was the last piece of the puzzle. He later wrote that after reflecting on everything, he remembered the axiom Sherlock Holmes made famous. If you eliminate all the possibilities, whatever remains, no matter how improbable, is most likely the truth. He had spent years eliminating possibilities, and what remained was an answer he never wanted but could no longer avoid. The Shroud's DNA paradox. In 2015, A team of geneticists from the University of Padua published a study in the journal Scientific Reports that added an entirely new layer of complexity to the Shroud mystery. They had extracted and analyzed DNA from dust particles vacuumed from the back surface of the cloth.
DNA testing are in. This unprecedented analysis has uncovered some astonishing information. The genetic material tested from the shroud is mitochondrial DNA.
And what they found was a genetic patchwork that reads like a map of the ancient world. They identified plant DNA from Mediterranean species, Central European clovers, North American black locust trees, and rare East Asian pears and plums. They found traces of a marine worm common to the northern Pacific Ocean. And in the human mitochondrial DNA, they found sequences belonging to haplogroups from Western Europe, the Near East, the Arabian Peninsula, East Africa, and the Indian subcontinent. Representatives of haplogroup H, common in Europe, were present alongside haplogroups typical of populations from India, which was unexpected. The researchers were careful in their conclusions. They noted that the most likely explanation for this diversity was centuries of contamination. The shroud has been handled by bishops, repaired by nuns, displayed to crowds, transported across continents. From its documented history alone, had the cloth moved from France to various Italian cities starting in the 14th century. If you accept the tradition that places it earlier in Jerusalem, then Edessa, in modern Turkey, then Constantinople, the chain of human contact becomes even longer. Every person who touched it, breathed on it, or stood near it potentially left a genetic trace. But the researchers also noted something that was harder to explain away. Some of the detected haplogroups, particularly those from the Indian subcontinent, did not align neatly with simple contamination from European handlers. They suggested one intriguing possibility, that the linen itself might have been woven in India, noting that the original name for the cloth, Sindon, appears to derive from Scindia or Scindian, a type of fabric associated with the Indian subcontinent. And the DNA findings did not prove anything. They explicitly cannot establish who the man in the image was. The contamination is too extensive, the degradation too severe, and the mixture of genetic material too complex for any clean identification. A Harvard thesis examining the DNA and hematological evidence from both the shroud and a related cloth called the Sudarium of Oviedo concluded that while the blood types matched on both artifacts, contamination on both is extensive and more collaborative research is urgently needed. What the DNA did was deepen the mystery. It added geographic complexity to an object that already defied chemical and physical explanation. And it raised a question that some scientists find more unsettling than any answer. If this is a medieval forgery, why does its genetic fingerprint suggest contact with populations spanning from India to the Near East to Europe, consistent with either an ancient journey or an impossibly elaborate fabrication? The honest answer is that nobody knows. And that uncertainty, that gap between what we can measure and what we can conclude, is where the real tension of this story lives. 17 years of truth. Barrie Schwortz carried the weight of the STURP findings for 17 years before he reached his conclusion. That is not the timeline of a man swept up in emotion. That is the timeline of a man at war with his own evidence, resisting it every step of the way, waiting for someone, anyone, to hand him the explanation that would make it all collapse. No one ever did. The thing that held him back the longest was the blood. He said it plainly, many times over the years. He could accept that the image was not a painting.
Yeah, it's 44 years later. And there was no paint, and it's not a painting or an artwork.
The data had eliminated that possibility within the first few days of the 1978 examination. But the blood on the shroud was still red, and old blood is supposed to turn brown or black sometimes within hours. That single detail kept him anchored to skepticism for nearly 2 decades. If the blood could not be explained, then something was wrong. Something had to be wrong. And then in 1995, he was on the phone with Dr. Alan Adler, the blood chemist who had been on the STIRP team, another Jewish scientist, a world-renowned expert on porphyrins, and Adler walked him through the bilirubin explanation one more time. The extreme trauma, the liver flooding the bloodstream with bile pigments, and the chemical interaction that preserves a reddish tone even as the hemoglobin oxidizes over centuries. And something finally clicked. Not like a light bulb. More like the last wall in a room he had been standing in for 17 years, quietly crumbling to dust. The question that had been keeping him from accepting the cloth's authenticity simply had its answer, and now there was nothing left to hide behind. But there was another moment that same year that pushed him over the edge in a different way. He met someone at a lecture who insisted the shroud was a fake, and when Barrie pressed the person on their reasoning, the entire argument was based on a tabloid article. That encounter forced him to turn the mirror on himself. He realized he had been doing something similar, holding on to a position not because of the evidence, but because accepting the alternative was too uncomfortable. When he finally examined his own perspective honestly, he found that the data had been telling him the same thing for almost 2 decades. He believed the shroud was authentic. He just had not been willing to say it out loud. What happened next was not a dramatic conversion. Barrie did not become Christian. He never did. He remained Jewish for the rest of his life. But something else shifted. He had walked away from his faith after his bar mitzvah at 13 and had not thought seriously about God for decades. Now, in his 50s, confronted by the implications of what he had spent his career studying, he looked inward and was startled by what he found. He described it in an interview years later by saying that when he finally looked in his heart, God was there, just patiently waiting for him to acknowledge him. The shroud had become the catalyst that reconnected him to his own faith, not anyone else's. In 1996, the year after he reached his conclusion, he launched Shroud.com. He built it because he was frustrated. He had watched media reports about the shroud for years that were misleading, inaccurate, and sometimes completely false. He had first-hand knowledge. He had been in the room. He had taken the photographs. And the nonsense he was reading in newspapers was not even close to the truth. So he decided to put the primary sources online, the actual STIRP scientific papers, the actual data, so that anyone in the world could review the evidence and decide for themselves. The site grew into the largest shroud archive in existence, visited by more than 15 million people from over 160 countries. Researchers called it the Shroud's Library of Congress. In 2009, he established Stera, a non-profit, and donated everything to it. The website, his entire photographic collection, decades of accumulated materials. He never profited from any of it. A man once approached him after a lecture, looked him in the eye and said, "Mr. Schwartz, that was a great lecture, but you will never convince me." And Barrie looked right back at him and said, "What makes you think I even care what you believe? That is between you and God. Take it up with him." He said that was the moment he understood his role. He was not there to convince anyone. He was there to put the facts on the table and let people make up their own minds. That was the obligation he felt came with the privilege of being in that room in 1978. And he honored it until the day he died on June 21st, 2024, at 77 years old in Colorado Springs, surrounded by his family. The shroud still waits in Turin, its secrets locked in fibers that defy explanation, its image challenging everything we think we know about history, science, and the human body. Centuries of study have illuminated fragments of truth, yet the full story remains just out of reach. What if everything we assume about its origins, its purpose, even its maker, is only scratching the surface? And what does it mean for the questions we are too afraid or too unprepared to ask? The cloth has been silent for hundreds of years. But the questions it raises are far from finished. Who or what left that mark, and why has no one ever truly solved it?